Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the time and effort training. We will get started in just a minute. Hello, everybody. Welcome again to the training. We're just waiting for a few additional folks to join before getting started.
And please, if you can also sign in the chat with your name and the name of your LEA. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome this afternoon. Thanks for checking in. Okay, what do you think? Should we go ahead and get started?
I think we could. 1:30.
Okay, great. Welcome this afternoon. We're very excited to have you all here for, I believe, Anthony, this is our fourth in our series of training webinars, right?
Correct.
Great. And we are excited to be here. We are presenting today on time and effort, and this time and effort training has been designed for you all as local educational agencies or LEAs, and we're hoping to help build the capacity of new or experienced program and business administrators to better understand the fiscal requirements, specifically as they relate to special education. This one relates much more broadly to other programs. And we're excited to talk through some of this today. We know there are several questions around this, and this is an important area. Our session today will cover the federal requirements related to documentation of personnel services compensation, which is commonly known as time and effort. And I'll do some quick introductions. We, Anthony, Mari, and I work for West Ed, which is a technical assistance and professional development, as well as research agency based in San Francisco. And USBE contracted us to help them provide additional coaching to LEAs. And when we work with states, we always say that supports are very important to pair with monitoring. And so when we think about fiscal monitoring, pairing supports with that is really important. And so USBE has invested in putting these webinars together to build the capacity of LEAs. So hopefully we can do more preventative audit resolution than post audit resolution, I would say. So today we have Anthony Makuna, who is calling in from Boise, Idaho, and Mari Shikazawa, who is on our team and is located in San Diego, California. And I am Sarah Dutray, and I work from my home office in Logan, Utah. So we're excited to be here. I'm guessing most of you have been to one of our other sessions, but if not, it's great to have you. In addition to these webinars, USBE has also provided in our contract funding to do individualized support and coaching to you all as LEAs. So What this means is that if you are interested in looking at your fiscal procedures or talking about fiscal topics, checking out some of your ideas with us, with one of us from our team, you can do that at the expense of USBE to go ahead and get some of that individualized support. So we wanted to share that can look like one-on-one coaching. That might look like if you have some policies and procedures that you're dusting off and considering revising, we could review those for you. If you need technical support on guidance on fixing something you know is a problem or you suspect might be a problem, we're happy to engage. That there's a nice firewall between us and USBE on that. And so anything we learn in those coaching opportunities will never be used to make a finding against you or anything. And some topics we could talk about are budgeting for next year. I think another hot topic that's starting to come up in LEAs across the country is potential reductions in LEA MOE this year because of an increase to IDEA funding. And in general, a lot of increased federal funds and more funds available. So if you have allowable exceptions or you can potentially use a reduction, that's something we're happy to talk through with you so you can get that into your annual project application. And state compliance, anything again that you are curious about or want to run by someone to see if you're doing it right, we're happy to connect and do that. So I'm going to have Mari put her number and email in the chat as well, because I know you can't copy it from the slides, but please feel free to reach out if you're interested in coaching. And our objectives for today, sorry, Mari, I had her put something in the chat right when we're changing slides, is that our session objectives for this session on time and effort are, first, that you will come away with an understanding of the federal requirements related to personal services compensation, that you'll understand that, or time and effort, as we like to call it. The next objective is that we are planning to and hope you'll be able to describe the documentation standards that are required to comply with federal regulations for federal funds, identify which staff must comply with those federal documentation standards, and we are going to introduce you to some resources, and we hope that you'll be able to locate those critical resources related to time and effort. A quick overview of our agenda, what we'll be going through this afternoon in the next 90 minutes or so. We'll talk about the regulations. We always like to ground these sessions in the regulations. Talk about the factors for determining allowability of salaries and benefits charged to federal grants, making sure we're charging appropriately, documentation standards, and then a time and effort decision tree. We'll go through some questions and see if we can't stump some of you. I think many of you are well tuned to the answers to some of these questions now, but we'll get into some questions. And with that, we're going to start with the question we generally have started all of these calls with, which is asking you to please rate your knowledge on the topic for today. So we have a Zoom poll, and we'd like you to rate your knowledge on documentation of time and effort.
Great, we're getting a lot of responses coming in.
Exciting.
And we'll give everyone just a few more seconds to respond. And then we will do the big unveil and show you all the results. All right.
Those are pretty decent results. We have some area for growth. Maybe we can get to a very strong by the end of our session today, but not very many in weeks. So it sounds like this is something that you all have thought about or know something about mostly. So we look forward to getting into this more with you. Thank you for letting us know your current knowledge. We also like to put up a slide that contains acronyms. We know, especially if you're new, and I know we have a lot of program staff on the call that work in special education programs, and you're new to the fiscal side of things, and then business managers are new to some of the special education acronyms, and so we share acronyms. So we'll just leave this up for a minute for you to look at those. Some of the most important ones today that we're going to talk about are the Uniform Grant Guidance and the Personnel Activities Report, the PAR. So you'll see PAR come up quite a bit, and then that Uniform Grant Guidance always comes up in these calls. So those are two to know about. And with that, I'm going to provide an introduction to the topic of time and effort. And time and effort is the process that LEAs use to justify allowable personal services costs to be charged to a federal award, such as IDEA. We're going to focus on IDEA today, but the standards we're going to talk about apply to other federal programs as well. And we're going to start with a quick review of the federal regulations process to understand how these rules trickle down to us. And then we'll talk about making sure we know what the correlation is between the federal regulations and the requirements, and what's important for you all as school administrators to know when making decisions regarding allowability of personal services costs to your IDEA grants. So on this slide, we have a little map of federal education laws and regulations. We start out with statutes at the top there. Congress passes a statute or a law, a bill becomes a law, and that is statute, it's passed by Congress. Then Congress delegates rulemaking authority to usually a federal agency. And so that rulemaking authority goes to an agency that sets regulation. And there aren't always regulations. Some statutes don't have regulations, but IDEA definitely has regulations. And we have regulations around the Uniform Grant Guidance. In addition to those statutes and regulations, we have non-regulatory guidance. And that's the interpretation of regulation by a federal agency or further guidance on implementation. Those are pieces that we add to support our understanding and sometimes provide some more detail. And when we're talking about our federal grants management laws and regulations and special education, there are some that are most important and that you who manage federal grants are required to navigate. And the top one on this list, Title 20 of the United States Code, which signals it's the statute, Chapter 33 is the IDEA Part B statute. So that starts at the top. You have the IDEA statute. Then you have 34 CFR Part 300. Those are our IDEA regulations. And then under the Department of Education, in addition to the IDEA regulations, we have the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, or EDGAR. Those are important because that's where we find Uniform Grant Guidance, or UGG, like we like to call it sometimes. State Program Administration regulations are also there, which often apply. So we have all of those to consider. And then on top of that, we have to understand the correlation and connections between those federal laws with our Utah Education Code and the USBE administrative rules and policies. So all of those pieces are what you should consider, and we'll try to point out where the requirements come from so you know where to reference back to. But for these fiscal requirements, it really is a combination of requirements and a lot of cross references to each other, references to, especially to EDGAR from the IDEA regulations. Okay, so let's do a quick review of the basic premises for consideration when we're determining allowability of salary and benefits for special education services. First, we have the definition of allowable cost. And this is important because no matter what we have to track for time and effort, if that salary wasn't an allowable cost, we don't need to track time and effort because we can't be charging it. So that's kind of why we're starting here. But the definition of allowable cost is in 2 CFR 200, which is in EDGAR that we just described in the section that we refer to as the Uniform Grant Guidance. And what that tells us is that an allowable cost is necessary, reasonable, and allocable to the special education program. It's consistent with policies and procedures. It's consistently treated with other costs, like with regard to indirect cost. If we charge indirect cost to one federal program, we can charge it to others, but if we don't want to charge that to this federal program. Though the cost is not used to meet any other cost sharing or matching requirements, it's adequately documented and it's incurred during the approved budget period. So that comes from the Uniform Grant Guidance. The Uniform Grant Guidance further goes into allowable costs for personnel services, that it allows remuneration paid currently or accrued for services of employees rendered. And again, this is the same as we just read in general, but it has to be during the period of performance of a federal award. It can include wages and salaries. It may also include benefits. And the last piece there related specifically to those salaries, that it's just to the extent to which the costs satisfy the specific requirements. So the specific requirements then are going back to the specific requirements that we just read related to reasonable, allocable, and necessary, and then the specific program rules. And then last, the Uniform Grant Guidance gives us a little bit more reasonable. These personnel costs need to be reasonable for the services rendered. They have to conform to the established written policy of the non-federal entity. So those are your policies and the state's policies. And they follow an appointment made in accordance with the non-federal entity's laws and or rules or written statute and meet the requirements of federal statute. So basically, this is saying that the importance of understanding those different rules is that we need to understand the state rules, because the state rules affect allowable costs under our federal funds as well. So just to sum up very quickly, costs for personal services must meet the allowability requirements just as any other cost under a federal grant. So all of the conversations we've had about allowable costs and the yes, no, it depends, and having to justify why we believe it's reasonable and allocable and necessary, those apply to our salaries and personnel costs as well. And again, it has to meet those allowability requirements and all allowable cost criteria under the federal regulations. There's no wiggle room when it comes to these compared to other funds. So thank you. And I am going to turn you over to Mari to keep us going.
Thanks, Sarah. Now we're going to discuss the standards for documentation of personal services. So I guess the question that we're hoping to answer is, what are the required standards for documentation of personal services under the Uniform Grant Guidance? And these standards are defined under 2 CFR 200-430. Personal services must be supported by a system of internal controls which provides reasonable assurance that charges are accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. So these are really just practices or mechanisms to ensure that nothing non-compliant is happening. Anything that works towards capturing the truth and accuracy of supporting documentation. So a signature and the verification of employees, knowledge of the person verifying the work performed, such as supervisors, this is all contributing to this in the verification of the time and effort documentation. And policies and procedures can be a control themselves and are really going to be essential in implementing effective reporting systems. They also must be incorporated into official records, reasonably reflect the total activity for which the employee is compensated. So essentially, you need to keep track of each applicable employee's work and support the distribution of the employee's salary or wages among specific activities or cost objectives if the employee works on more than one federal award. So we're really trying to see for which award the employee is benefiting. And continuing with this definition, significant changes in the corresponding work activity are identified and entered into the records in a timely manner. Again, the goal is to capture the accuracy of the work being done. The system of internal controls includes processes to review after the fact interim charges made to a federal award based on budget estimates. So budget estimates alone are not allowable, but they can be used for interim reporting purposes. And unfortunately, there still does need to be internal controls in place to review based on the actual expenditures. And again, all the necessary adjustments must be made such that the final amount charged to the federal award is accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. So here we get into a little bit more about the use of budget estimates. So under 2 CFR 200-430, those budget estimates alone do not qualify as support for charges to federal awards. But again, they can be used for interim accounting purposes, provided that the system for establishing the estimates produces the reasonable approximations of the activity actually performed. And within Utah, USPE Special Education Rules section XT sets the same time and effort standards for state special education funds. And again, there must be some sufficient documentation that reasonably reflect the total activity for which the employee is being compensated by the LEA. So in summary, why is time and effort important? What was the intent when documentation standards were established? And the answer is in the allocability of a cost to a particular program. Again, cost must be necessary, reasonable, and allocable, specifically allocable to the special education program to be allowed. And this can be significant from a financial standpoint, since so much of our money goes towards salaries. So when we're talking about the allocability of costs, we're asking, is a cost allocable to a particular federal program? And it is if the goods and services involved are chargeable or assignable to that federal award in accordance with the relative benefits received, right? We're trying to make sure that the federal award that we are charging to is receiving the benefits of the labor. Time and effort is an internal control mechanism. Again, that internal control piece to justify that allocability of costs to a federal award, and time and effort effectively documents the benefits received by that particular program. So we are getting to our next poll question.
Awesome. So then we want to see if you are paying attention to what Mari and Sarah was saying here. So what purpose does time and effort documentation have for establishing allowability of cost? A, it ensures that the cost is reasonable or necessary, allocable, or all of the above. So what is the intent and the purpose of time and effort? So we'll give you a few seconds to respond. And then Mari will go over the answer.
And we've still got some responses coming in, so I will give you guys just a few more seconds to respond.
And also, we always encourage you to put in the chat why would you think the correct answer will be A, B, C, or D. Like, what's the reasoning behind your choice? If you can share that with us, that'll be really helpful.
All right, we've slowed in our responses, so we are going to display the answers. So this question was a little bit of a trick question, right? We obviously want to make sure that all costs are reasonable and necessary and allocable to the federal program, but specifically the documentation of time and effort is to ensure the allocability of a cost to a specific federal award. So at this point, we're kind of assuming that the other necessary steps have been taken to ensure that the costs are reasonable, necessary, and allocable, but we're really trying to demonstrate how much of the time was spent on that federal award. And now I'm going to turn it over to Anthony.
Thank you so much, Mari and Sarah. So, yeah, as you saw, Mari and Sarah did a really good job laying out the federal requirements around time and effort, and also the intent behind the requirement of time and effort when it comes to the compensation of personnel services with federal grants. And like I said, when I read the federal regulation, I feel like it's always important to try to understand the regulation, the requirement by itself, but also to understand the real intent behind the regulation. And then the best way to get to a better understanding of the intent of the regulation was to revisit time and effort in the past. Where does this come from? So let's share a bit of an history of time and effort. Time and effort originally was codified under the OMB Circular A87 called cost principle. It was a set of regulation for federal grants recipients like state and local governments. And within that regulation, they included specific requirements on how entities that receive federal grant should document the salary that are being paid to employees using federal grants. And the regulation established two standards: semi-annual certification and a personnel activity report, commonly known as HAR. If you can go to the next slide. So this is the verbatim citation from the Circular A87. So what did it say? For semi-annual certification, so where employees are expected to work solely on a single federal award or cost objective, charges for their salary and wages will be supported by periodic certifications that the employee worked solely on that program for the period covered by the certification. And the regulation added that this certification will be prepared at least semi-annually and will be signed by the employee or a supervisory official having first-hand knowledge of the work performed by the employee. So under the Circular A87, this was the standard. If you work in one cost objective or federal program, then they want you to do a certification twice a year, and you will have to sign that certification, or your supervisor, who knows the time that you spent on a specific program, should sign that certification. This was the standard. And then the same regulation also—
Hey, Anthony, before you move on from that, there's a question in the chat from Max.
Okay.
And he asked, it has been our understanding that USBE requires signatures from both the employee and the supervisor. Is this still the case?
Okay, for this one, I think do we have call on the line if you can weigh in?
Yes, I believe that was the case when Neil and I started. That was our understanding of it. But I believe that we've adjusted our understanding to be what it is now. You have to have one or the other, based on the things we've learned through WestEd and other conferences we've attended. So yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think the bare minimum was to have at least a signature of one or the other. But I mean, I've seen in my own experience that, entities have collected signature from both the employee and the supervisor. And we have a follow-up question. Is that applicable over all federal programs for Utah? I want to say yes, but I want to speak for them. Cole, if you want to weigh in.
I don't want to speak for the other federal programs. I'm just going to say that's applicable for SPED. And so I would just recommend following what is in the uniform guidance and then talk with your program contacts there at USBE. I'd hate to step on other people's toes and give bad information.
Thank you very much, Colin. Sorry for putting you on the spot. Do we have any other question in the chat before we move on? Yeah, we like these questions because this is the time to get clarification, because time and effort is a complex concept and gets grant recipient in trouble sometimes. So as we present, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. So the next standard for the personnel activity report under the Circular A87 was that SPAR will be required when we have employees who work on more than one federal program. Let's say you have an employee who works on IDEA special education program and also work on maybe one of the title program. That means 2 separate programs, then you need to do a personal activity report. Or if we have an employee who works between indirect cost activity and direct cost activities. A good example for that will be if you have an LEA who is maybe partially a business manager and also a special education director. Typically, a business manager at the school district level is an indirect cost because they do work that benefits several programs, and that's not easily traceable to a specific program activity. However, a special education program runs the special education program. So these are direct costs that could be charged directly to a grant. So if you have an individual working between these 2 different cost activities, then you will be required to complete a personal activity report under the Circular A87. Or if you have 2 or more indirect activities which are allocated using different allocation basis, or if you have a staff who works on allowable and non-allowable activities. Let's say you work on an activity that is allowable under IDEA and special education, and also work on an activity that is not allowable under IDEA, then you would need to track personal activity, your time with a personal activity report or PAR. If you can move to the next slide. So to summarize the standards from the old OMB Circular A87, you had 2 choices when you have staff working and being compensated with federal grants. If the employee works 100% of the time in one program, they need to do a semi-annual certification, and that certification must be signed at least by the employee or the supervisor. And if you have an employee who works for more than one specific federal program or multiple cost objectives, in that case, under the old OMB standards, the staff will need to complete a personnel activity report, also called time and efforts monthly log. And also, the report must reflect an after-the-fact distribution based on actual activities performed. And that form must be signed by the employee, not the supervisor, but by the employee. The supervisor's signature could come in addition to that. These were the standards. Sarah, did you want to say something? Now, what I just presented to you were the standards, old standard under the OMB Circular A87. That standard is no longer in effect. This is like, for people who have been in federal grants management for more than 7 years, you know what I'm talking about. But if you join the federal grant management community after that, you probably never heard about it until today. And this regulation was superseded by the Uniform Grant Guidance, UGG or ARC. And under the Uniform Grant Guidance, the requirements for time and efforts are similar to the old regulation, but they're not exactly the same. And then I remember back in the days, it was around 2014, 2015, we used to get a lot of questions from people like, it looks like under the Uniform Grant Guidance, semi-annual certification and personnel activity reports are no longer required like it used to be with the old OMB Circular A87. The answer will be on the next slide. Do you still have to do it or not? This is what the Uniform Grant Guidance says. So for a non-federal entity, where the record do not meet the standard described in this section, the federal government may require personnel activity reports, including prescribed certifications or equivalent documentation that support the record. So if you remember what Sarah and Mari just shared, as far as the standard under the Uniform Grant Guidance, how do you document time spent on the program? If you are not able to establish a system that can produce evidence that are in compliance with the requirements under the Uniform Grant Guidance, then this reverts back to our PAR and certification. The only difference is that under the Uniform Grant Guidance, they did not provide a lot of details on how a PAR looks, how a PAR should be presented, or how a certification should be presented. So that pretty much left room for interpretation. Because when the Uniform Grant Guidance came, this is all they said, and people were wondering, can you show us an example of other way of documenting time and efforts, which could be different than a normal PAR or a semi-annual certification? At that time, the OMB was, I think, said that they were going to release additional guidance of example. It's been 7 years. We still haven't received it. For that reason, that's why a lot of organizations pretty much fell back to the old regulation, because those regulations were in place and vetted by everybody and also accepted by most auditors around the federal grants community. So that's pretty much the similarity between the old and the new regulation. And in addition to that, the Uniform Grant Guidance also gives more flexibility to grant recipients to document time and effort using different other methods. So if, for example, you feel like you have great ideas on how you could document time spent on a specific federal program, you should run it by the Cognizant Agency for Indirect Cost. And in Utah, the Cognizant Agency for Indirect Cost is the Utah State Board of Education. So if, for example, you feel like you don't like doing personnel activity reports, you don't like to do semi-annual certification to document the amount of efforts spent for a specific federal program such as IDEA, then run it by Cole and Neil, and they'll determine if your idea is acceptable and compliant with the federal requirements. It is an additional flexibility. So in summary, the Uniform Grant Guidance, when it was implemented, gave more flexibilities to grant recipients to develop their own system that can demonstrate compliance with time and effort. So an effective documentation standard is still required. You must be able to establish that if you paid for $50,000 of the salary to a specific employee, you must be able to demonstrate that paying that specific employee with IDEA was benefiting IDEA. That means the employee spent time working on IDEA purposes. Since the regulation, the Uniform Grant Guidance gave a lot of flexibility, but did not give a lot of specifics of, what is an example of a good standard for documentation? And the OMB never really provided other guidance. That's the reason why the old standards, OMB A87, are always and will always be a safe option if you don't have anything else. And that's the reason why most organizations pretty much refer back to the old standard to establish what a time and efforts requirements should look like for documentation purpose. And in addition to that, you have an option to explore other alternatives, like a substitute system, if approved by the Utah State Board of Education. All right. So this was a little bit of a history of time and effort to help you understand where we came from. So now we have a poll question, and Mari will help us read the question.
So under the Uniform Grant Guidance, what documentation is acceptable for time and effort? The semi-annual certification, personnel activities report or PAR, substitute system approved by USBE, or all of the above?
Okay. And this is a test to try to determine if you are paying attention to what I just said. And again, we really want to make this interactive. Let us know why you think A, B, or C is the correct answer in the chat. The chat has been pretty quiet today. So if it's just semi-annual certification, can you put in the chat why you think it's semi-annual certification? Or if it's all of the above, why do you think that? Okay, the chat is still pretty quiet. People don't want to take a risk to give a wrong answer.
We'll give you plenty of more options and opportunities to engage.
All right.
The poll seems like it's slowing down. Anthony, should I show the results?
Yes, please go ahead. All right. So 3% think semi-annual certification is acceptable. 21% think the PAR is an acceptable type of documentation. 2% think the substitute system, and then 71% all of the above. And the correct answer, there's no wrong answer here, but there is a better answer. And the best answer among the 4 options is all of the above. Under the Uniform Grant Guidance, you have an option to use semi-annual certification. You have the option to use PAR. You also have the option to use substitute system if approved by the Utah State Board of Education. So 71% is a passing grade. C, get degrees. All right. Do we have another one? Okay, we do. Mari, please go ahead.
Yes. So the next question is, which of the documentation options allowed under the Uniform Grant Guidance must be approved by USBE prior to using? So is it a semi-annual certification, a personnel activities report or a PAR, a substitute system, or all of the above?
Okay. Then we'll give it a few seconds. And again, if you can, share your thoughts in the chats. I still haven't seen anybody trying to share with us their logic. Okay, finally we have one. Thanks, Max. So without any further guidance from OLMB or OSEP, we have continued to use the same time and efforts documentation as we have always used. What would be really helpful is to have some guidance for some substitute systems used by other LEAs. Okay, so this was not related to the poll. Okay, I was getting too excited. So this is a question.
I think it's related to the poll. It's demonstrating that Max understands the question.
Okay.
And I think he's just saying, while it's allowed, it would be great to have some examples. Cole, has for your knowledge, for special ed, has USBE ever approved a substitute system yet?
No, not that I know of. I
Okay.
know when we do review documentation, we do and we accept if people are paid hourly, if they have a timesheet, if they clock in and out in different codes that are tied to different programs. We really like that one. So, but as far as the different system apart from these, I'm not aware of any.
Okay.
Thank you so
Anthony,
much.
do you know of any that LEAs that you worked with in other states have used? Or is that something we could maybe follow up with Max on, see if we can find some examples and maybe post them with the materials for this if there are good examples. I don't know if there are many.
Actually, in the next section of the presentation, I mean, I have two examples of a
Oh,
substituted
perfect.
system.
Okay, I'll let you keep going.
But yeah, but these are the most common one. But other than that, we have not seen a lot. And here's the reason why. OMB was supposed to come out with the guidance around time and effort
Yeah.
because people told them that uniform grant guidance gives a lot of flexibility, but it's pretty vague. Like, give us example. They never did.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. Since they never did, that's why, the same issues is.
Yeah.
So, but I'll share a couple examples of substitute system here in the next section.
I think we
question,
are
Max.
all excited to get to the next section. So I will share the poll results. And it seems like there was an overwhelming response that substitute systems was the correct answer.
Oh, we got to a B now. Even better. Yep. And the correct answer is yes, substitute system. Yeah. If you use semi-annual certification or PAR, you don't need to run it by Cole or Neil. It's safe. It's accepted. But if you want to be creative, yeah, please do. Don't implement something without running it by them. Right. That being said, let's move on to the next section. Now, we talked about the regulation, we talked about allowability of cost, and then standards for documentation. Now we will share with you some example of what time and effort documentation look like. And before we get there, I just wanted to do a quick pause and revisit a definition of cost objective, because cost objective is a concept that has been interpreted in different ways in the federal grants community. But under the Uniform Grant Guidance, the cost objective is defined as it may be a major function of a non-federal entity, the LEA in your case. It might be a particular service or project, a federal award, or an indirect cost activity. Like, for example, your IDEA federal grants, is a cost objective. And if, for example, you have a situation where you have indirect costs versus direct costs, these are also different cost objectives. But for the purpose of the example that I'm going to be sharing with you, when I say cost objective, I imply the special education program. Okay. Like I said, the Uniform Grant Guidance gave more flexibilities when it comes to time and effort standard. The old regulation, A87, was more restrictive. You did not have other options. You have to do that PAR or you have to do that semi-annual certification, otherwise you are in trouble. But Uniform Grant Guidance came and say, oh, you can do this, but you also can do other things if they comply with the federal requirement. And under the semi-annual certification, so if you want to use the semi-annual certification as a documentation, in which situation should you use it? If you have one employee who works on one cost objective or one program, like the special education program, and the individual is being paid using the IDEA fund. So all you have to do is just a semi-annual certification that will be signed twice a year, certifying that, yes, I provided service for the special education program and you're good. And that documentation pretty much justify why IDEA was charged. A semi-annual certification would also work for an individual or a staff who works 100% of the time in the special education program. But maybe the salary is paid using two different funding sources. Maybe your IDEA fund is not enough, and you pay a portion of the salary with your IDEA federal grants, and another portion of the salary with your state or local fund. For that stuff, you still can do your semi-annual certification, but in your semi-annual certification, just specify that, yeah, you worked 100% of the time in special ed, and this was the salary distribution. And when you do that, you're good to go. And that salary distribution should also match the actual salary distribution within your accounting system for payroll. personnel activity report. This is when you have an employee who works on more than one program. So not just the special education program. So you have an employee who works on special ed and maybe general education or other different federal programs. When you have a situation like that, this will trigger standards like a personnel activity report. Doesn't matter, how the funding sources are distributed, but the fact that the time is spent in more than one program triggers a requirement for personnel activity report. And the next slide is just an example of a compliant semi-annual certification. This is pretty much in line with the example that I shared in the previous slide. So you'll have the employee name, the position, the reporting period. Are you certifying for which period, like starting and end date? And then the first table is an example if you have one employee working on one program, which is special education, and salary is being paid with two different funding sources. Or maybe the employee is just being paid with one funding source and working on special ed. That's the second table. And then you have the employee signature or the supervisor's signature. Like we read, we only need one of the two, but most organizations collect two signatures. Okay. The next example is the monthly personnel activity report. This is when the time is spent between different program or cost objective. Maybe a portion of the time is on special ed, a portion of the time is on title, a portion of the time is on general education. Then we need to track the distribution. So we have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
I did. I was just asking if we'd be able to use these. We're pretty new to needing to have this report. And I really like your examples. They're very clear and very useful. So I just wondered if we'd be able to see the slides and use some of those examples as our basis for those reports.
Yes, they will be shared with USB and I think they get posted in the website. So you will have access to these resources.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt this.
Oh, no. Yeah, feel free. When you have questions, please interrupt, ask in the chat. Any more questions before I continue? Okay. So we have another one here. Carl Shakespeare said that our payroll software that shows employees' approval of their hour meets the requirement for a signature on par. Is that correct? That's a good example of a substitute system. Carl, please go ahead.
Yeah, if they have to fill in their time and code it to different things, and then when they submit it, they have to go in and acknowledge it or electronic signature, whatever, that would be allowable as them signing it, because it would record on there that they approved it and whatnot.
All right, thanks, Carl. Carol, does that answer your question? I hope you did. And if you didn't, please let, all right. She said yes, thank you. All right. Any more questions? So yeah, this is a good example of a personnel activity report. So if you could go back to that, sorry. So yeah, the personnel activity report shows the distribution and then you track the time spent on each activities. And then this spreadsheet will give you the percentage of distribution between the different activities. And you also have to make sure that the distribution of payroll within your accounting system matches the percentage in the personnel activity report. Because the personnel activity report gives us information that this is 25% was charged to IDEA. Okay, then we also need to make sure that when we run the payroll report will also show 25% of salary actually charged to IDEA. If there is a discrepancy between your payroll report and this personnel activity report, you might want to do a reconciliation to make sure that the percentage distribution aligns. So you have something in the chat. will this recording be shared so that we can share and we watch? Oh yeah. Oh, thanks, Mari. She already answered. Yes, it is being recorded and will be shared. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. All right, like we said, a substitute system must be approved by USPE, the Cognizant Agency for Indirect Cost, and may include but are not limited to, for example, timesheets that record employees' effort accurately reflected in the payroll. A good example is if you have a good timesheet system, where when you track your hours for a specific activity, that can be tied to a funding source. And that timesheet allows for a certification. That timesheet captures all the information that would be included in a normal personal activity report. And if you run it by Cole or Neil and it is approved, then you can start using it as an alternative.
And Anthony, we have a question in the chat. So Rod asked, an electronic time clock system where the employee use the password to check into different programs. Would this suffice for a substitute system? Pending
That's
approval by USBE.
That's a really good question. Like I said, must be approved by USBE, but if you want Anthony's opinion, a system like that, if you track time clock and use different passwords for each program, if your payroll distribution is designed to follow the same clock in and clock out based on the password, then that system should be allowable. However, you still need some sort of certification, because if you remember under the old standards, the employee must sign. Do you have a way of signing in your time clock? So I think these are things to take into consideration.
Anthony, could the password, having to enter a password, be counted like an electronic signature because you have to put the password in?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair interpretation because the password is something unique.
Yeah, it's something unique to you and you're entering it in knowing. You'd probably want to have like somewhere on record, like telling them having that.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting, Rod. In the past, it's not been allowed. Maybe that's something we should talk with Cole about and think through, like how we might justify it, because it's an interesting thing to think through, is if that password could be seen as a signature, just like a checking the box and clicking like I agree to this. And maybe it could be like a once a year thing that the employees sign, that when I enter my password to clock in, I am agreeing that the hours that I'm charging to federal programs were charged to those federal programs or something like that. You could maintain documentation, just have them sign something once.
Good point.
I don't know. I like to be
Sarah.
Creative. Cole can push back, but we can keep talking through that. There was one other question, and Cole, this one's probably for you, and it's whether there's one person at USBE that can approve an alternate system for all federal funds, or will it have to be each title and federal program specialist separately?
I'll answer Rod real quick. Rod, shoot me an email, give me an example of like what you guys are doing, like a timesheet that does that. We'll set up a time and we'll look it over. And if me and Neil have any questions, we can definitely come back to Sarah and Anthony. We'll talk about it with them and make sure we're all good. As far as one person at USBE that can approve an alternate reporting system for all federal funds, I don't believe we have somebody that could do that right now. But where this fiscal monitoring team is all coming under a fiscal monitoring manager, that could be a possibility that because we would definitely want to have programs kind of on the same page doing the same thing. So yeah, we will definitely look into that and try and get all federal programs on the same page.
Thanks, Cole. It looks like Davis, Stephen from Davis, says they'd like to join and use a similar example to send to you to consider. And Dan might be someone to talk to about that because they're verifying the entry of the time when inputting the time. And he wonders whether the finance division who sets the indirect rate that cognizant agency, if that could be the same person that could approve them all. So probably a couple of questions for Cole to take back and think about with the team, because I'm sure the USDE team would love to have it streamlined as well, so they're not all approving it and potentially giving different answers even, right?
Mhm. Yeah. And I saw a comment from Rod who said it dumps from the time clock directly into the payroll. You know, a system like that at least allows you to, you know, charge the appropriate portion of time spent on the program to a specific funding source. I think the biggest issue here will now be the certification piece. If the USB does not accept a password as a signature, another alternative will be like what Sarah said. Maybe we could have them do a certification semi-annual. That's, you know, what your time clock that is completed every week is pretty much you doing it. Something like that. There's a way to make it work. And then we have more. Well, help me here if I'm missing anything in the chats. So
yeah, it looks like in the chat, Max just commented that it does, like sometimes there is a disconnect. And Cole, I don't want to speak for you, but what I put in there, I think that's one of the reasons you all are coming together in one office now around federal programs finance, is that so you can become more consistent and hopefully do some streamlining and consolidate some of those pieces so one approval could count for multiple programs. And then Mandy is giving evidence again. I think that should encourage Rod and Stephen Snow to go ahead and submit, because it has been approved by USDE for Mandy's system for the payroll system that the schools work with. They sign in to clock in and out, and then it allocates to their programs. And then they approve their timesheet through their password, and that has been allowed. And so it sounds like maybe there's some language, and if this is something we could help coach you on, we'll help you put that language together. But Mandy's language, I think, is really strong there. That login with the password, they're counting that as approval of a timesheet, and then that the system allocates that time to the program, the specific program funds.
Yeah,
Right, Anthony?
Like I said earlier, you know, we've seen times, like Mandy was saying, we've seen timesheets where an employee will clock in for like 2 hours under a special ed code, and then they go into their timesheet and clock out, clock in under general ed for a few hours. And those are acceptable, which is what Mandy's talking about. So maybe with Rod, we have just a little bit different understanding or a slightly different system. But yeah, we'll definitely work with everybody to make this work if you guys have these systems. Yeah, like has been said, just shoot Neil and I an email. We'd be happy to meet with you guys, go over what you have, and see what's going on.
yeah. And again, Wested is available for coaching session. If you want some idea and you're wondering if your system is compliant, or if you have a missing piece that could make your system more compliant, we're more than welcome to set up some coaching session with you to try to see if we can establish a procedure that would make it more efficient and reduce the burden on the LEAs. All right, great questions. All right, if we don't have any more questions, let's continue. So, well, can you stay on the slide? No, the previous slide, yeah. Again. So, another example of a substitute system will be a par with work schedule officially documented that do not change throughout the school year. Because you were asking me for an example that I've encountered in my own experience. This was pretty much the most typical one. And we also have the use of other statistical methods. I have not seen this. I mean, it's available, but I have not experienced that in my life to try to determine, like, you know, based on some sort of, you know, random sampling or statistical methods, this is how we determine that this is how much IDE should be charged. We have another question. So how long is coaching available? 1 month from now through the summer, once a year? Sarah.
We have an ongoing contract, I think, for 4 more years with the state to do coaching and similar trainings to this to help build that up. So we definitely can do that through the summer or 1 year. again, we don't report to USBE the content of the training, the coaching at all, just that we've provided the coaching. So please reach out to us.
Yep. Cole and Neil are not allowed to those meetings. And we don't record those, we don't take notes. It's just between you and I. You and us. All right. I hope that answers your question, Melanie. Yeah, so yeah, these are the options for substitute system. So if we can go to the next slide. So what I was referring to a personal activity report, instead of doing it monthly, because under the old standards, personal activity report must be completed every month. However, you could do a PAR instead of monthly, you could start completing it semi-annually in this situation. You have a staff who works on as a federal program director, special education director, and maybe non-federal program activities. And based on the work schedule, like, you know, we know this is what she does or he does every Monday. This is what he or she does every Tuesday, Wednesday. It stays the same from weeks to week, from month to month, throughout the entire school year. And when you do the allocation at the end of the school year, and your time distributions ends up being 41%, 14%, 45%, then you could use a personal activity report. Instead of tracking hours daily, weekly, you can just sign this certification semi-annually and then attach what is in the next slide. Something like that. It's a work schedule that will show how activities are distributed throughout the year, the week and throughout the day. And again, this is an option that will need to be approved by USBE, but this will reduce the burden of having the employee tracking their hours every single day. So options are up there. And then again, if you need ideas, we are more than welcome to try to brainstorm those ideas with you. All right, unless we have any more questions about these different examples, I will let Maury take over from here to continue the time and effort decision tree.
Thank you so much, Anthony. So this is an actual tool that we hope that you can take back to your district and use in real life when making decisions around time and effort. So it's just a very simple decision tree, and walking through each question, first you're going to ask yourself, is the employee an employee of the LEA? If it's no, then no further action is needed. No time and effort documentation is required. If the answer is yes, you'll have to ask yourself whether or not the employee is paid with IDEA and or other federal funds. If the answer is yes, then time and effort documentation is required. And if the answer is no, then you're going to ask, are costs counted towards MOE? If the answer is yes, again, time and effort documentation is required. And again, the reason for this is because in the USBE state board rules, they require you to track state special education funds in the same way that you're going to be tracking those federal funds. And of course, if the answer is no, then fortunately no time and effort documentation is required.
Mari, before you move on from that one, I just want to make sure everyone understands, because I know USBE does the MOE calculation for LEAs in Utah. Oh, Sandra's asking in the chat, are costs counted toward MOE? So for maintenance of effort, that are your counting, and I think USBE does that calculation mostly on your behalf. So you probably, if you haven't heard about the calculation, that's a good sign. But the LEA maintenance of effort requirement requires LEAs to budget and expend the same amount from year to year. And so it's looking back at a comparison year, and that test can be done using local funds if you use local revenues for special education, or the combination of state and local funds. And for most LEAs in Utah, that is going to be state funds. Some LEAs, especially those of you in a charter school LEA, do not have local funds. And so this would be all of your state special education funds. And then if you have to use general funds from the state to pay any costs of special education, then when those go in under those program codes, they're likely coded toward MOE as well. So if they're state funds or state and local funds that you're using, they probably are counted toward MOE. And so that's the standard, but given the proportion of most people's costs that are paid with state funds, it's probably a safe assumption that if you're paying for a special ed service from it, it should be counted toward MOE. If it's not other federal funds, sorry, if it's state funds, so any state revenue or any local revenue, if you are able to generate local revenue.
Okay. And I'm gonna add something and speak for Cole. And I think because you also want to document how you justify charging your state special education funds. And if you don't, fiscal monitoring could be not so interesting for you. Cole, let me know if I misspoke.
Great. Sandra, did that answer your question? Thanks for asking. That's a really great question that I'm sure a lot of other LEs have questions about. And you can all thank Cole because he is in charge of calculating all of your MOEs and making sure that you are all compliant under IDEA. And we know it's a tremendous amount of work. Any other questions related to the decision tree or otherwise? Okay, so now the real fun is going to begin. We are going to get started with some real life examples. And we will be asking that, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. We have another poll. And the question is, for which of the following employees is a semi-annual certification or something similar most likely the best documentation? And the selection is A, a paraprofessional working with special education and general education students, B, a 100% special education director. Oh, they're all a 100% general education teacher, or D, all of the above.
Yeah, and again, please let us know why you think it's the paraprofessional, the SPED director, or the general education teacher. This will be a good way to determine if you made some progress in your understanding of the requirements. And if you don't get it right, Cole won't hold it against you. Don't worry about that.
I feel like we are missing our go-to answer of it depends.
Oh yeah, that's like Sarah's favorites. It depends.
Yeah.
I usually call it the lawyer's answer.
Yeah, exactly. It's the spin answer. I'm just looking at like a paraprofessional and thinking, do they work with the same special education and general education students every day, all year? Anyway. I won't throw everyone off.
All right, we've seen the responses slow down, so I am going to close the poll and share the results.
Okay, so we have 12% who think that the employee who will be required to do a semi-annual certification is the paraprofessional working with special education and general education students. 59% think a special education director. 18% is 100% general education teacher. 12% all of the above. And the chat was pretty quiet because this was a tricky question. So the correct answer is B. A special education director works in one program, regardless of whether they are being paid with IDEA or state and local funds. It's that one program. And then if IDEA is used to pay for a portion of the salary or for the totality of the salary, they only need to do a semi-annual certification. Just going back to the example that I shared with you. For example, A will be wrong. Why will A be wrong? It's because this is a typical example that triggers a personal activity report, or maybe a substitute system if you're annoyed with doing a PAR every month. That's why a semi-annual certification in that situation won't work. And this is why I was asking, why do you think this is wrong or right? But 59% think choose B, which is the correct answer. Good job. Next question.
All right, and we do have a few polls, so my apologies before we get into the real fun. Oh, the next poll is, are employees working 80% or more on IDEA activities and 20% or less on non-IDEA activities required to document time and effort? And the selection is yes, no, or it depends.
And now let Sarah take that one. Because we have your most favorites, it depends.
I know. I think this is the one where we get to hold people to, if you mark it depends, you should put Y in the chat, right?
Oh yeah.
Yes or no are easier to justify, but is that it depends.
And we're still seeing some responses come in, so we'll give it just a little bit longer.
Okay.
Ooh,
Some
I like
reactions.
that, Brian. It depends how they're getting paid, not just what their activities are.
All right, get your answers in, and we're going to close this out in just a few seconds. All right. Here are the results.
All right. Sarah, do you want to go over the answer or do you want me to go?
Go ahead. Go ahead. I just like to, I like to add to what you say.
Oh, okay, cool. So yeah, our employee working 80% on IDE required to track time and efforts. And we have 80% saying yes and 20% say it depends. Nobody says no. So I think nobody got it wrong. But the real answer is yes, correct. If the employee works 80% of the time on IDE activities and 20% of the time on non-IDE activities, they need to document time and efforts because you have to be able to justify, if you end up paying them with IDE funds, you have to be able to justify that only 80% of the salary should have been paid with IDE. If, for example, you ended up paying the specific employee 90% of their salary with IDE when they only work 80% of the time, that means IDEA was overpaid by 10% of the salary. And that 10% is pretty much not allowable. It's unallowable under IDEA and the Uniform Grant Guidance. And then the best way to make sure that you could justify that you paid 90% or 80% will be through documenting it using time and effort. So the correct answer is yes, and good job. So Sarah, did you want to add anything? I'm not sure it depends will work on this one.
No, I mean, it's IDEA activities. If you're paying them 100% from local funds, nope, local funds you'd have to. If you were paying them 100% from ESSER funds, those are federal funds, right? So they don't count toward maintenance of effort. They're not requiring that. No, I won't try to make it a stretch. I think you're right. I think it's that they're being paid with those funds.
Yeah, because here we're talking about the activities. That means like the time spent on the program is 80% special ed. Yeah, this one is a little complicated, sorry. All right.
Yeah, I'm just thinking through, you could still pay them. Even if you pay them, I think this is good to talk about, even if you pay them 100% from state funds, not federal funds, if they're state funds that are state special education funds, or again, state funds that go toward maintenance of efforts that are paying for those special education activities, you'd have to document.
Yeah, because Cole would want to know if 80% was supposed to be paid or not.
Exactly.
All right, thanks. Now let's move into the next one.
So one more poll. Requiring PARs to include hours allocated to each program for exempt salaried employees for the purpose of time and effort documentation violates Fair Labor Standard Act record keeping. The options are true, false, and it depends. And again, if you want to go out and say it depends, we'd love for you to include a response in the chat.
Yeah. And then the reason why we included this question is because I think the USD received questions like that. So we would want to hear from AEAs that brought that question to the departments, what they think. I'm just curious to know.
And we're still seeing some responses come in, so might want to give it just a few more minutes.
Okay. No reactions in the chat?
Okay, the responses have slowed. So for the purposes of time, I'm gonna show the results.
All right. And 86% of the audience said false, 8% true, and 6% it depends. And the correct answer is false, B. If you have exempt employee, that means like those employees that are paid like with salaries. Normally under the Fair Labor Standard Act, you have no requirements to track their hours, as opposed to a non-exempt employee, an hourly employee. So when you have an hourly employee, under the Fair Labor Standard Act, you must keep their hours, because this will help you determine, how are you going to pay for overtime and some other related benefits. But when you have an employee who just gets paid for the time, for the work that they do, it doesn't matter how long that takes them, you don't have to keep their hours. However, there is nothing in the regulation of the Fair Labor Standards Act that restricts a federal grant recipient from tracking hours of this exempt employee, especially if you need to track those hours to come up with an accurate distribution of time spent on different activities. So that's the reason why, even though under the Fair Labor Standards Act, you are not required to track hours, but if for federal grant purposes, you need that to determine the accurate distribution for payroll purposes, you could still have them track their hours. So by doing it, you're not violating any sort of any federal regulation. However, you are complying with the Uniform Grant Guidelines. Anything else that you want to add, or Sarah, Mari?
I will just say that I'm going to add a reference citation to the Fair Labor Standard Act, since we don't have it on any slide. So I'm just going to include that in the chat for anyone that wants to do a little additional reading to what you just
Yeah, good idea. Good idea. Yeah, that's the citation from the act, and then you can read all the requirements for the different type of employees, and nothing there will tell you that doing it goes against these regulations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. So we only have about 6 minutes left. Sarah, Anthony, what do you think? Should we try to get to a couple of those real life examples and do a live test your knowledge? Okay, great.
Yeah.
So our first question is about a special education paraprofessional providing special education and Title 1A interventions. Is time and effort required? And again, if you respond, it depends, we'd love to hear a response from you in the chat, or feel free to unmute and just let us know what you're thinking.
Yep.
And since we only have 5 minutes left, let's do a little, maybe we should do these a little bit rapid fire. Okay.
Okay.
And here are the results.
All right. 94% said yes, and 6% it depends. Different from the special education allowable cost training. As the training was progressing, the number of it depends answer was growing, but this is the other way around. And the reason is because, when it comes to internal control, compliance with the documentation, there is not a lot of gray area most of the time.
No, it's not nearly as subjective as, and I think that goes back to the earlier question. I have to remind myself about why time and effort is about allocability, because this might, like, the time and effort could establish allocability, but we still need to make sure it's reasonable and it is necessary, right? So
Yeah.
if this special education paraprofessional is providing those, but there are no special education children, right? Like, the time and effort would help you see that as well. But I think that, to me, is this, when we talk about allocability, that's much less objective than necessary and reasonable. And so to me, that's usually where it depends, and we can come up with something that could be reasonable for a certain kid. So yeah.
That's a great way to present it. Thanks, sir. And yeah, the correct answer was yes. PAR will be required in this situation.
Okay.
We can wrap it up. You only have 4 minutes left, Smart.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that sounds good. Should I just move through all the slides really quick?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So as you see, there are a bunch more examples that are included in these slides. So feel free to refer to those, quiz your own knowledge. Let us know if you have any questions. Again, we are available as a resource.
Let's go ahead and do this poll, Mari, just to get our after of where we're at with how we're feeling about our knowledge of time and effort.
Yep.
So if you don't mind, now that you have attended our training, please rate your knowledge on time and effort requirements as they are now.
Look at that. Ooh, we got a couple very strongs. We have a couple very, they can't see it yet, huh? I forget that sometimes, but it's looking good.
But it's good. It's exciting because we started with 0.
Yes. Mari, do you want to go ahead and share the answers?
Yeah.
So we have almost everyone in strong. Everyone that reported they were weak at the beginning either left or has moved to strong or very strong. But I think a lot moved to strong, and then a couple bumped up to very strong, and not nearly as many fairs. So we hope this was helpful. It will be recorded and posted on the USBE website as soon as we are able to get the video ready and accessible, so that can be posted on the website. We will post the slides as well. Anthony, do we have those examples in like a Word document or something that might be easier to use than the slide that we could maybe include with that as well?
The semi-annual certification in PAR? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll include those as separate documents or Excel sheets. I'm not sure which they are, so you have those examples as well. Other examples or other resources, the regulations are on this slide. Those are always good to refer back to. And then we want to end with another pitch that we are available. Our team is available to do coaching with you as LEAs. Again, USBE has made it a priority. They've increased their fiscal accountability around special education quite a bit over the last several years, and they want to match that with increased supports as well. So they've invested in this, and we're happy to get together with you. And if it's to help write a justification to share with Cole for your alternate system to document time and effort, that's something we could help with, or other questions as well. So please reach out to Mari to set that up. On the final slide, you have all of our email addresses as well if you'd like to reach out directly. But we appreciate you coming today, and we will be in touch.
Thank you all.